Welcome to Power to the Patients, a LinkedIn Live and podcast series hosted by Power, where clinical research leaders across sponsors, sites, CROs, and patient advocacy groups discuss patient centricity in clinical trials. We explore the bottlenecks in today's system, challenge the status quo, and talk about future opportunities for innovation. Let's dive in.
Today, we're joined by Bryan Wylie. Bryan, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us, talk about patient centricity. I know it's a topic that's dear to your heart. But before we jump into that specifically, I'd love to maybe just for the audience, give an overview about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here to talk about patient centricity. I think it's something, as I've been in medical device for over 20 years, clinical research. I've kind of been in a lot of cardiovascular, electrophysiology, heart failure, renal denervation. But I think as I've run trials and had teams that we've been running trials, it's hard. And I think enrollment can be harder than you think, finding the right sites, et cetera. But I think one of the things is finding patients, and patient centricity is kind of that focus on the patient and throughout the life cycle of the trial, and how can we make a trial, easier to understand for that patient? How can we get that more access to more a diverse patient population? And then, how can we make it a little bit less cumbersome to be in research? Because there's so many novel therapies. And I think the reason I got into clinical research is to help patients. I think that's a lot of our why. We all know somebody that's been in a clinical trial. I like that there's this new approach to really focusing on the patient, and I think that's going to help us create better trials, and that's kind of my background and my passion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, let's go there. Let's talk about how you think it's going to impact the way that we do trials, and how is it going to help us create better trials?
Yeah, it's great. I think really considering patients throughout as I said, throughout the life cycle of the clinical study. And how do they fit in? I think, sponsors we're doing a good job of trying to bring a little bit more patient focus in. But I think in the past, and it's still, we think of patients as a subject, and, as a number, n equals. And we have a lot of pressure on us to execute trials and maybe sometimes not deviate too far from what others have done in the past. So there's a lot of risk we want to get approvals. We want to get these good innovative technologies out there. But if we take a step back and really think about the way the patient interacts in all the different steps, I think we can do a better job. I think one of the things I think about is education. How do we get the scientific data to a patient in a way that they could understand it, that they understand the risks going in? I mean, we have our informed consent process, but it's usually a lengthy document. It's almost so legal that a patient would tune out. But, one thing when we've been having discussions in the past, I think the Power platform is really nice that you're taking clinicaltrials.gov info that's hard to navigate and a patient isn't really used to it. As a sponsor, as researchers, we're on it every day, so we understand it. But taking that information and kind of bringing it over to the patient and then trying to condense it down in a user-friendly way. And so I think that's a patient-centric approach that could really help. But a recent trial I was doing was a heart failure trial, and I know that the device has been implanted in, say, thousands of people before. I know it's been in people for 20 years. It's approved in the FDA for another indication, by the FDA and the European regulators for another indication, and the data is very compelling to go into the area that the study was researching. But how do you get the patients to understand that this is a really innovative therapy for their condition, and it has a lot of safety data. So I think you've been trying to address that with patients too. How do you get that safety data, risk data? How do you categorize it so a patient can digest it? And importantly, the patient's family, the loved ones are often key.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this topic of education and understanding, the potential safety implications, especially in trials, studying devices or drugs that are better understood, is so important. How do you do it today? So you were just on this journey. How did you approach it today? How are others doing it today?
Approaching getting education out there.
Yeah, and like meeting patients where they are with the information that's relevant.
It's a great question. I think we're still using some of the standard methods. Patient recruitment materials. Most sponsors will create a brochure. They're good. They touch on this a little bit on the surface. You have to say that there may not be benefit, that there are risks. So they will have the risks and the benefits in front of them. It's very common. I've done this a lot, creating a website for patients to be able to go to. I think the more information you have access, the patients and their loved ones have access today, because people do Google so much, the more they are able to get out there and find information, the better. But I think we could do better, and it's maybe finding better platforms to reach patients. Is it always going to be a brochure, or is it going to be a website? Or, I have in the past used Facebook to create Facebook tags for the clinical trial, or we've used Twitter. Twitter sometimes maybe is more investigator or research team focused, but I think new platforms are definitely going to be a key. And then, new technology that maybe can condense this data a little easier and help patients get to it and understand it. I think as a clinical researcher, and I know most of my colleagues in their career, we get a lot of people contacting you and say, my loved one has this condition. Do we know of any clinical trials? And they don't know where to start. And so I think we could do better there. Is kind of what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah. What are the top 3 things you would like to see on our website to support this patient education material that is so critical?
Yeah, I think like on your website, what I think would be great is a patient has a very specific condition like atrial fibrillation or persistent atrial fibrillation, and they can go on your website, search that, and it comes up with a number of trials. Then when you click into them, it can tell you, really quickly being able to summarize the eligibility in an easy to understand way. And then I think, how do you get, for instance, the trial I was just referencing earlier in heart failure, if there's 16 trials that have come before it, if there's 150 PubMed papers and a lot of safety data, how do you get that? And how can you help the patient condense that down into almost a score or something digestible that they could really understand the safety of the device, or, the risks in the weighing the benefits as well.
Yeah, I love that idea. So you're going to love our this new feature that we've just developed. We're calling it simplified eligibility, and it's essentially what you've just described, which is on each study page, being able to really simplify the eligibility criteria away from kind of the clinical stuff towards more patient-friendly terminology. So at a glance, anybody can kind of read through and understand, could I be a fit for this study? But I want to talk about this idea of a score, because the idea of creating a score has been on our minds for quite some time. For all intents and purposes, let's use the Zestimate example from Zillow, right? It's a quantifiable score, but you know how much the dollar value of a house is, and it's not so objectionable. How would you think about like a safety score? Like what dimension would that even be on?
I think it would be really interesting, especially, maybe I'm getting ahead of my thinking, but I think with, AI, if you can digest all of the data and really get an understanding for what's out there and help put it into context of risk, benefit. And then when you're able to kind of click in and drill down to easy digestible metrics of why this is safe. And I think going back to your Zillow or Zestimate, there's a lot of measures in real estate that we know, like price per square foot or the scores of a school district, et cetera, that make your house worth a certain amount. If we could find those metrics for clinical studies and make people feel comfortable with it, I think it could be a great benefit.
Interesting. And is this score like out of 100 in your mind? Like what? Like I'm trying to get the sense of like, is this like a 99 out of 100 kind of score? Like what is this?
I think we looked in a patient-centric way. Maybe a patient might respond a little bit better to 1 out of 10, or we know 7 and above is very safe, and 6 is experimental therapy. That if there's nothing else out there for you, maybe that's a good number.
Yeah, you could almost see like a walk score kind of solution here. Have you seen those like walk scores on like Realtor.com or maybe some of those other rental platforms where they kind of grade apartment units with like, oh, this is in a 95 out of 100 walking neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you click in and maybe it actually unfurls 6 dimensions of safety and there's a like objective way that you kind of score points against that.
Yeah, and I think to back up the scoring, really having the categorized metrics when you click into it so that it stays relevant, it stays scientific, and it doesn't become marketing, but yet it condenses it down. And I think if you're onto something, because we do like our 4.5 out of 5. You know, I go to a restaurant and I want to see a score of 4 or 5.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of, patient centricity from a patient education perspective. I know one of the things that you think a lot about is the site experience. Can you talk a little bit more about patient centricity from the perspective of sites?
Yeah, I think, from the perspective of the sites, the sites also have the enrollment pressures that, the sponsor does as well. So one, for the site, getting the word out to patients and having them maybe come to them is really would be very helpful for the sites, and for the patient. Also, I think, kind of helping sites manage their resources a little bit with help the patient. Dashboards that can organize the patients that have come into the pipeline and where they are in the process. I think it very much help research and patients. I think technology is, again, always something that is going to start continuing to help patients, researchers, and sponsors. For instance, just simply automated follow-up visits, text messages, or different tools that can really like ping patients. I think from a site perspective, we could help the sites by designing our follow-up visits with patient needs in mind. For instance, a lot of research is going for decentralized visits, where one method you could bring a clinician out to do follow-up visits in the patient's home. That could save a lot of that, loss to attrition, patients maybe not being able to make follow-up visits and moving away. I think it benefits the patient in a way that they now have a lot less burden. Sponsors do this really well, and I think it helps the research teams, but providing travel reimbursement.
Sure.
I think going a step further, maybe thinking about within the lines of an IRB approval, but thinking about, can we offer ride shares? Can we offer transportation? Some of our patient populations can be in their late 70s, early 80s, very sick. And to think about them getting to follow-up visits for the next year and a half can be tough. So I think continuing to think about it every step of the way, where there might be roadblocks and where patients might suffer, and it also starts weighing on the sites and the sponsors as well.
Yeah. So, there's been a lot of talk about these decentralized or hybrid clinical ops models. There's also been a lot of talk about increasing site burden. And when I think of those two things together, anything that feels like it requires new processes to be adopted across a lot of sites, or now we have to get clinicians out of the site and into the home, all feels like increasing complexity from a site perspective. How do these things come together in your mind, or how do we marry these two themes?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, every time you introduce something new, there is different logistical concern. And I think on this topic, I mean, as a sponsor, we need to be sitting down early as we're designing the study and really working with, working with the research team and patients, maybe not at the same time, but separately, but having them kind of help weigh in on some of the places where we've got roadblocks. For instance, if you met while you're doing your trial design with patient advocates or patient advocate groups, they might say heart failure patients are too sick to be going and I'm just making this up, going every 6 months to a follow-up visit, you might want to consider this, or I know that, they're not mobile, et cetera. I mean, and then if you went and started talking to research coordinators and research teams and investigators that are designing trials, I think they could maybe say, oh, you're going to put this new process in, and it's not going to fit with our hospital SOP, or something that could show roadblocks. So I think kind of the very high level answer to your question is, if we involve some of that thinking, some of that planning into the design process, I think we can start getting to a place that has a more streamlined partnership between everybody that would help trials be a lot more efficient.
Let's talk a little bit more about like implementing this stuff. So what does it take to actually get all this stuff off the ground?
It takes a good operations team to get all this off the ground. I think these are, as you said, these are new concepts. So I think it takes definitely a team with an open mind and a little bit of time, pre-planning, to understand that some of this, if we implement these things correctly and we do it well, one, some of the platforms might cost more money up front, but if it increases enrollment, increases patient kind of happiness during the trial, and the research teams have less burden on them, I think the trial runs faster. We know that trials for a sponsor can be very costly per month. You shave 2-3 months off of the study, it's a significant amount of money. So I think really starting in the forefront and planning this out is important. There's a lot of great platforms like yourself that can help bring patients to the research teams, but making sure that they can implement that, it can be implemented up behind their firewall, that there's the business agreement set up in advance. I think all that pre-planning can be very helpful. And then I think what you get at the end is you get maybe more patients understanding what the study is, more patients willing to be in the study, hopefully less attrition, less workload on your research sites, and maybe some of these platforms organize the patients, kind of show you where they are. And so a lot of those tools and techniques, I think, can be very helpful.
You mentioned, save 2 months, incredible impact, right? For the not just for the trial, but for the program, for the asset,
as well as the patient, because patient will then hopefully get an approval quicker, or be able to get into the study quicker.
Absolutely. What are the things that you have seen drive that amount of impact the most regularly? What actually gets people to these 2 months, 3 months of time savings? Everybody talks about getting there, but what have you seen to really work?
Well, it works to getting people to actually realize that 2 or 3 month impact, or talk about it and plan for it.
To realize it.
To realize it. I think, as a sponsor, we're always, I think I read a stat recently that 80% of trials enroll slower than, sponsors should. So we're always thinking of ways to try to help our sites, patients, help ourselves enroll faster. So, and we're willing to spend money to realize that, hey, sometimes, 2-3 months could be 2-3 million in some studies. And I think little things have helped, but I don't know if we've really found exactly the right solution to get, huge months worth of savings. But definitely, I think some of the things that I've done is really partnering with your sites, having great customer service as a sponsor, creating efficiencies. You talked about how you putting some new systems in can be an efficient or logistical challenge. Really making sure CRFs are efficient, database efficient, instructions are efficient. We've thought about our follow-up visits. We make amendments to the protocol when we find that something maybe is too cumbersome in inclusion-exclusion criteria. All of those things together are just really working, always keeping an eye and a pulse on the study, and seeing how it's going. All of those factors together, and then start realizing months of savings. But I think on topic of the patient centricity and new platforms, I think there's a lot there for us to do even more, and then maybe have more consistently help.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe a spicy question, but what do you think people are getting wrong?
That's a good question. I don't know if we're I don't know if maybe getting it wrong is the right way, but maybe I don't know if we're really doing and doing things differently. As I said earlier, it's pretty risky as a sponsor. Say, going back to an example when I was, an AFib ablation study. 4 or 5 studies have come before you. They've been run a certain way. The FDA has guidance documents on how to measure AFib and detect things, and you don't. Sometimes sponsors have a hard time going outside of that box. They want approval. They don't want to take the risk. One instance would be certain monitors for arrhythmias. They're cumbersome or they're not the best technology. There's much better technology with like 24-hour patches or even possibly wearables or implantable link device. But that would actually get you more information than others have collected. It could skew the data. It could be better, but it could be worse. So I think sometimes implementing things that could help the study, help the science, help the patient, unfortunately, aren't done because they're risky to deviate outside of what's been done. And so I think that would be one thing possibly we're getting wrong in inhibiting, maybe putting in some of these new techniques that can be more helpful to the patient, to the research community, to the science.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this different in med device versus drug trials? Like, how do you think about that?
Most of my career has been med device, so I really am focused there. I don't necessarily think it's different. I think pharmaceutical has, they're usually much larger studies, statistically driven. I think in some ways patients are really more accepting of a pharmaceutical, taking a pill, than sometimes getting a medical intervention or even a surgery.
Interesting.
But I don't think it's that much different. I think we all have the ways we think, the way we do things, and we're sticking to it. Things evolve, but it takes a little bit of time.
I'm really interested in this idea that patients might have more concern around a med device, especially if it's implantable, right? How do you bridge the kind of patient education challenge there? Like it sounds like the hurdle might be even bigger in patient education there. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's as I think about this, I think one of the keys to enrolling, one of the keys to running a good study is patient education. As I was saying, an implantable device or an ablation procedure or any kind of an interventional procedure runs a little bit of risk, but we have so much data out there showing how low in some of the cases the risk is, how routine this has been. We try to get that information out, but that goes back to what we were speaking to earlier. How do we package it in a way that it's really understandable? And sometimes it's, how do we package it in a way that's understandable for patients and their loved ones, but also the research teams and the physicians. I think that, medicine, we're taught to be very skeptical and complete evidence, and that's smart. But I think there's a lot of things that this safety data could be supporting of this and supporting of that, and therefore this expanded education should hold a lot of the safety that the past indications have as well. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that is the challenge. How do we get this information to patients and communities to understand that?
Yeah. Are there like ways that you frame things that you have found to be more comprehensible for patients?
Yeah, I think we definitely. I think the stats that the health literacy of the average American is pretty low. So how do you we write our ICFs in, I think, 5th to 8th grade language. We try to really keep the lay terms within our brochures and our patient websites, but I think there's still an opportunity maybe to dig in and find out, what do patients respond to and what information do they need. And it's kind of going back to, we started talking about patient-centricity, but I think bringing the patients in and having them kind of give input into recruitment materials as you're building it, input into ICF language, how do they read it, do they understand it? So bringing them in early in the process could help sponsors reach target audiences better. And then new technology platforms. Are we reaching patients in the right way?
Fair. So I want to talk a little bit about the past, and I want to talk a little bit about the future. So traditional patient recruitment, what does that mean to you?
I think traditional patient recruitment is, you create protocol, you create your recruitment material, you hand brochures out to the site, you have a field team that tries to help educate the research teams, but it's really just scrolling through EMRs and clinic and patient records and having your chart of inclusion criteria down. And it's kind of a process that relies heavily on the research team's shoulders and how much resources the research team has. I think that's kind of the historical way that it's been done, and it works really well in some cases, in some indications, in some trials, and in some it can be challenging to find patients, especially if these aren't patients being seen on a daily basis, or something a rare condition that how do you get to the patients? How do you find them?
Yeah, absolutely. And what about modern patient recruitment? What does that mean to you?
Modern patient recruitment, I think it's within like my first example. Really great success was working on a renal denervation project. We needed resistant hypertension patients. How do you find patients that are resistant to hypertension meds? They're really living deep within parts of the hypertension clinics. So we use Facebook, and you can create a Facebook page, created awareness, gave information there. You search demographics and keywords, and we started being able to reach more patients and bring them into the funnel. Had a call center that would do some screening questions and then get the patients to the site. So that's it's not as modern as it used to sound, but it's something that was working. But I think just platforms, how do you get to some of these select patient populations? How do you search using some of the social tools we have, demographic searches, et cetera? So that's one of the modern ways. I think even platforms like Power that can go and condense information quickly. We can search trials, so patients that didn't know how to find a clinical trial that might be helpful for a certain condition can go there and then connect with sites or find out more information about it. Another kind of a modern approach.
Absolutely. I'm so curious about this Facebook group that you created, or this Facebook page. What was it? A Facebook page? Was it a Facebook group? Was there a difference?
Page, like named as the study title. Really easy to start out. Consultants will come out and tell you how they can do it for you, but I would almost encourage everybody, if you're interested in starting a Facebook page, it's really, you almost just start it, put up a banner picture, put a few pictures, put some key information, and then start searching demographics around the, say 50 miles from every hospital that you put in all of the patients. But yeah, it was Facebook page, but it was almost very simple to set up.
And you just you set it up, and then you started searching. You just started inviting people to the page, to like the page, to follow the page.
When I started, I kicked it off by inviting my contacts. I think these pages gain relevance on this feed by the number of people in it. I seeded it with my contacts, and then I think since then it's grown to thousands that have interacted. Actually, there was one arm of this specific trial really extremely slow, and they did attribute the Facebook page to finding more of these patients just because they were a select group that really didn't exist within the day-to-day practice. And I wouldn't say maybe didn't exist, but weren't characterized to where it was easy to find these patients.
Yeah, fascinating. Now, I know one thing that IRBs tend to get concerned about is when there's too much commentary happening amongst patients or whatnot that is outside of the like approved communications. And I imagine that kind of stuff happens on Facebook pages all the time. How did you think about that when you were running this page?
This was I think 2016, so there was still sort of a little bit of a gray area, but we did use all IRB approved material on our website. Subsequently, at another company, another trial, we did submit the Facebook page content to within our submission, and we did have the IRB approved. So using our IRB approved language. However, I think one of the things you're touching on is you do have the risk of a troll coming on and making some comments, or somebody making some negative comments, or you wouldn't want to stifle real talk. But I think one thing we did on the first page is really kind of limit the amount of comments on these posts you could comment on. Some of it was just advertisers getting the word out, getting it out to the patrons.
Yeah. The thing I love about this play of yours was that you went to where the patients already were, right? These folks were already on Facebook. They didn't have to work that hard to find your page after you'd already made it on Facebook. And you contrast that, I think, with like the strategy of creating microsites. And there's nobody out there that's looking for the microsite, right? There aren't people just passively looking for your microsite. So being on Facebook where there's a network of patients, I think made a lot of sense.
Yeah, and the key was the demographics. The people who searched hypertension or certain drugs, this would be pushed onto their feeds. And I know in some ways we don't like it, but it's a really beneficial way to get information to the right person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think as we do that, at the same time, Facebook might not be the right tool for a study that some clinical studies, they're recruiting from a patient already scheduled for a procedure. So in some of those studies, like even AF ablation, a patient is kind of scheduled. The doctor says AF ablation is guideline therapy. You're scheduled for it. We have a new catheter. Here are the benefits. Would you like to do it? I don't know if that would be a right study for Facebook, but in these patients that are really hard to find, sometimes that can be.
Yeah, I wonder what the new way of doing this would be, because people aren't on Facebook the way that they were before, right? I wonder what the new way to do this would be.
Luckily, they say a lot of the older
Fair.
Maybe it's still good, but I have heard some teams have flirted with the idea of TikTok and having a little bit of just there's a really short reel or TikTok about the study, or Instagram's been used, and Twitter to some extent. But again, I said earlier, I think Twitter is something physicians really find helpful, negative information. There could be a Twitter page that's not very patient-centric.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think there's something out there that's more. There's new technology, there's new platforms. I think we haven't quite figured out the best way. But I do know your team is working on bringing more information to patients.
Yeah. Well, we want to be a place that patients are when they're learning about clinical trials, and then in doing so, be the best place to connect those patients with the trial teams that are actively trying to meet them as well. Well, Bryan, hey, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I'm going to give you the kind of traditional closing question here, which is, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it and change anything about how clinical research is done today, what would you change?
I think selfishly, from the sponsor, I have two answers for this if you want it. But
yeah, please.
From the sponsor point of view, I think site startup can be a very painful process. Every sponsor uses essentially the same clinical trial agreement with very similar language. And every site, we get hung up on three sections. It's subject indemnification, maybe sometimes even publication policy, or subject injury. But we always get through it, but it could take months. So the budgeting, the clinical trial agreement process, I think they could be streamlined a lot to get away from the 3 to 6 month startup times. So that's a pain point for sponsors, particularly. And it seems like you could really go faster by just sitting down at a table and negotiating in real time. So that's kind of my sponsor. I think the next thing, if I could change something, magic wand, it's enrollment. Enrollment, it's really tough to stay on reasonable enrollment timelines for a new study. And everybody's putting all of their minds and thoughts on trying to, how do we fix enrollment? And I think this discussion today is really centered on a lot of that. We can make it easier for patients to understand a trial, get into a trial. We make the trial easier for the patients and the research teams, and then people can start being more productive. I think everything starts coming along a little bit better, and it affects enrollment, retention, and then even if you're doing this right and really thinking about the patient and advertising and getting the word out in the right way, I think we increase diversity in the trial and getting this trial out to more people. So there's my magic wand. I don't know if it's too ambitious, but I'd love to tackle those two things.
I love those two things. I mean, at the end of the day, they all come down to time, right? Two really important problems that are routinely bottlenecks for researchers and for patients. Well, Bryan, hey, again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, have this conversation. I've so enjoyed it, talking about sites and patient centricity and the future of this industry.
Thank you for tuning in. If you haven't already, please follow Power on LinkedIn, sign up for our live events, and engage with us in the conversation. We hope to have you join us next time on Power to the Patients. Take care.